Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. So if you've been catching the news lately, you've probably seen a bunch of headlines about a massive, escalating trade dispute between the United States and India. And, on the surface, it just looks like your standard political tit for tat, but actually there is a massive hidden iceberg beneath those current headlines. Today, we're going to unpack exactly what is driving this clash, layer by layer, using the history and the data that, quite frankly, usually gets left out of the conversation.
I want to anchor you immediately to this, frankly, staggering number: 50%. That is the aggressive blanket tariff the U.S. has currently leveraged against Indian exports. Think about that for a second. That means half the value of targeted goods coming from India into the U.S. is just being tacked right on as a penalty tax. It's a massive hammer to swing in international trade. But the big question we need to ask is, why swing it at all?
And more specifically, why is the U.S. using such aggressive trade tactics to force open India's agricultural markets? That's really the central mystery of this explainer. The U.S. desperately wants India to buy its farming products, and India is absolutely refusing. They are willing to take a massive 50% tariff hit just to keep their doors closed. To understand why India is willing to take that kind of economic pain, well, we've got to look a bit below the surface.
So layer 1, the tool of trade. Let's take a quick look at the history of tariffs.
To actually understand today's trade war, we first have to look at the weapon being used. And tariffs aren't new. In fact, they go all the way back to the 18th century BC, when local rulers in modern-day Iraq and Turkey started charging traders what they called an ashatum, basically a permission fee just for crossing their territory. Fast forward to 1721, the UK passed the Calico Act. That blocked high-quality textiles from India and China just to protect local British weavers. But the true, absolute danger of tariffs really emerged in 1930 with the U.S. Smoot-Hawley Act, where America slapped huge taxes on foreign goods to protect jobs during the Great Depression. And wow, the retaliation to that was incredibly swift.
Those unchecked tariffs literally caused global trade to plummet by a massive 66%. I mean, the 1930 trade war was so economically destructive that post-World War II nations actually came together in 1947 to form the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which eventually became the WTO. They set this up specifically to stop countries from blindly throwing tariffs at each other. They learned the hard way. The trade wars are incredibly dangerous for everyone involved.
Moving down to layer 2, the historical grievance, the food dependency trap. You see, India's absolute refusal to open its agricultural market isn't just stubbornness. It stems from deep historical trauma. Because the last time India relied on the U.S. for food, it nearly ended in a complete disaster. After World War II, the U.S. had this massive surplus of low-quality grain. To offload it, they passed PL 480 in 1954. This allowed struggling, newly independent countries like India, who were facing severe famine at the time and definitely didn't have US dollars, to buy this surplus using their own local currency. At the time, honestly, it seemed like a total lifeline.
But that dependency grew rapidly until an astonishing 40% of India's wheat was coming directly from the U.S. And here's the kicker. This wasn't premium grain. Reports from back then noted it was basically pig feed, barely even fit for human consumption. But the real breaking point? That came in 1965 and 1966. The U.S. wasn't happy with India's stance on the Vietnam War or its conflict with Pakistan, so Washington actually delayed the food shipments as political leverage. Imagine being blackmailed with starvation. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi found the whole experience so humiliating that she pivoted India toward absolute agricultural self-reliance. From that moment on, their trust in foreign food dependency was permanently destroyed.
Now for layer 3, the economic trap. The very real threat of GM seeds. Beyond that history, there is a modern economic threat that absolutely terrifies Indian farmers today. Foreign agricultural giants operate on a brilliant but totally ruthless 4-step business model. Step 1. They sell seeds that are genetically modified to survive their own brand of weed killer. Step 2. Farmers are forced to buy and spray that specific chemical. Step 3. Contracts legally prevent farmers from saving seeds for the next season, which, is a practice that has existed for millennia. And step 4, the companies extract massive, recurring annual royalties. It literally locks farmers into an inescapable financial cycle.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how grim the financial reality on the ground is. Take a genetically modified crop like BT cotton. For a single seed packet costing 1,600 Indian rupees, the foreign corporate royalty cut can be a staggering 1,250 rupees. That massive extraction pulls the overwhelming majority of the profit straight out of the hands of local Indian farmers.
Plus, we really have to realize that Indian farmers simply cannot compete with the U.S. government's checkbook. Heavily subsidized U.S. corn costs roughly 1,700 rupees per quintal, while India's minimum support price, literally the bare minimum needed to keep its farmers alive, is 2,400 rupees. If borders suddenly opened to free trade, this incredibly cheap, subsidized U.S. output would instantly decimate local Indian farming through market dumping. It wouldn't even be a competition.
And honestly, the ripple effects are terrifying. Cross-pollination means genetically modified DNA inevitably mixes with normal crops. Because GM crops are banned for human consumption in places like the EU and Russia, India's own exports would get rejected globally. And we've seen this movie before, right? When Mexico and Haiti are forced to lower their agricultural tariffs under trade agreements, their local farming sectors completely collapsed, leaving them utterly dependent on U.S. imports. India's looking at that exact history and saying, yeah, no thanks.
Which brings us to Layer 4, the dairy dilemma. This is basically an immovable red line.
So if agriculture is a non-starter, India's dairy sector is an absolutely immovable red line. We're talking about over 400 million people in India directly or indirectly dependent on the dairy industry. But they're operating on razor-thin profit margins of just 3 to 5%. If the U.S. were allowed to dump its impossibly cheap, heavily subsidized milk into the Indian market at roughly 30 to 35 rupees a liter, it would wipe out the livelihoods of millions of people overnight. The economic shockwave would be absolutely catastrophic.
But hey, it's not just about economics, it's also a profound cultural clash. See, in the U.S., cattle are often fed meat, bones, and blood meal to increase their protein intake, and they're regularly injected with artificial BST growth hormones to boost production. India, on the other hand, has incredibly strict religiously driven import requirements demanding a purely vegetarian diet for cattle. So, allowing U.S. dairy into India isn't just a threat to jobs, it's a non-negotiable violation of deep-seated cultural and religious sentiments. All right, let's head back up to the surface, the present day. Escalation and tariffs.
Now, let's connect all of these historical and cultural layers to the actual political domino effect that triggered today's 50% tariffs. Back in 2018, the incredibly aggressive US-China trade war caused China to basically stop buying American agricultural products. US agricultural exports to China plummeted from 32.9 million tons in 2017 to just 8.2 million tons in 2018. American farmers, who are a super crucial voting base for the US president, were hurting badly. The US administration desperately needed to find a massive replacement market to absorb all those crops. And their target? India.
But as we've just learned, India is absolutely not going to open its agricultural market. And this resulted in a rapid tit-for-tat escalation. The U.S. demands open agriculture, India refuses, so the U.S. retaliates by revoking India's special trade status. India fires right back with a 2% digital service tax on American tech giants. Frustrated, the U.S. imposes blanket 50% tariffs. And India? Rather than bending to the pressure, they simply pivot to sign free trade agreements with other nations. It's U.S. desperation meeting India's historical protectionism head-on. It is literally an immovable stalemate.
Which finally brings us to the collateral damage. $48 billion. That is the estimated amount of Indian export trade currently caught in the crossfire of this 50% tariff penalty. We're talking textiles, garments, footwear, industries that employ millions of regular, everyday people who have absolutely nothing to do with genetically modified seeds or dairy cows.
So, what should you take away from all this? Well, this isn't just some squabble over spreadsheet numbers. It is a full-on collision of deeply rooted national interests. The U.S. administration desperately needs an agricultural win for its domestic voters, and the Indian government literally cannot open its markets without risking the total collapse of its farming sector and severe political backlash at home. With 50% tariffs locked in, and India rapidly turning to other global markets to bypass the U.S. completely, I leave you with this. When an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, who's going to blink first? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.